Rick's going to give you a microphone.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so just pin right here.
You can make a big production of it. Does Dr. Cook here?
I have not seen him. He knows about it. But,
Up in his 80s, I don't know if he'd make
yeah, it's harder and harder for him to get around.
It's a lot less than I did. On my Facebook. I'm looking forward to your comments.
Well, you gonna tell us some good stuff tonight about
Gonna try.
We are.
He's not taking notes.
He and I.
You need to watch this guy.
Yeah. How you doing?
All righty.
I'm Bob's wife, Melanie.
Hey, nice to meet you.
And I'm not from Vienna. I grew up in South Louisiana. But this man has made sure I know everything. Everything.
Do you know where Alan Green's house is in Vienna?
Well, it's actually not in Vienna, Wesley. You know.
Yes,
that.
it is.
There's one that's a little bit further out, White Light.
Ad Golf's house is where Alan Green first lived.
See, I bought that land with Kenneth Goff in 1974.
Well, that's where Alan Green lived. That's where Green lived.
Oh, I thought he went out to Greensboro after he sold that place.
He lived there. One of his daughters is buried in the yard.
Stephanie, you remember that? And it says, 3-year-old daughter of Alan.
Check 1, 2. Can you hear me, or am I coming through out there? Cindy, can you hear? We will turn this up. Can you hear up front here? Is this good?
Excuse me.
All right, let's get started. This is going to be very exciting tonight. I'm so looking forward to this. My name is Rick Godey. I welcome you to this house. This is the Lincoln Parish Museum and Historical Society, and this is the continuing Chautauqua series. And Wesley Harris is going to be talking about the founder and father of Lincoln Parish, Alan Green. A couple of notes I wanted to get to you. We're going to be live streamed tonight as well, so folks can be watching this on their phone now, which reminds me, silence your phones now. Thank you. And I better follow my notes here. These are incredible. These are the sesquicentennial coins. They're $20. They're on sale in the back. Cash or check. If you do a check, Lincoln Parish Museum, the proceeds are going toward the restoration of the historical markers. Wesley has targeted 3, or I should say the Sesquicentennial Committee has targeted 3. Robert Russ, his marker has long gone. If anybody knows where it is, we can get it. We know somebody who can restore signs. But no, that's one, and I like the idea what Wesley said. It's going to go on the Greenway, which is close to where his house was. The second one is the colored Chautauqua in Grambling, and that reminds me, Phyllis Miller is here 1 week from tonight. 1 week from tonight, she is going to do her Chautauqua speech again, because it is packed with so much information. So we need to get many generations here to hear about our history and the colored Chautauqua, and it's no coincidence that we have 2 prestigious state universities here in one parish, and the root reveals the fruit. That is Gardening 101. So the roots of Lincoln Parish, in my opinion, from my observation, is education. And that's one of the tenets here of the Lincoln Parish Museum, is going to be education, exhibitions, and events. And tonight we're going to cover 2 of those. We're going to have education as well as the event. So Phyllis will be here 1 week from tonight, same time, on the colored Chautauqua. So help us help more by pushing and getting the word out. So, and then the final. Phyllis is in the house, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Miss Kay, the ever teacher always. No, Kay Prince, thank you. And the third marker is Vienna. And that one just kind of disappeared off the face of the earth recently. So proceeds from the sale of the coins. What's that? He did? Do we have an insurrection happening here right now? Okay, proper decorum. The coins are 20, and the sesquicentennial T-shirts are in the back as well. These are 25. So proceeds are going to go toward those initiatives, and donations accepted. And if you're paying by check, Lincoln Parish Museum, We have a Facebook page, if y'all would be so kind, like it and then follow it, because I put a lot of information out there, and the more we have, the more we help. The more we have, the more we help. We also have a YouTube page, and I encourage you to go there as well. We're streaming right now live to that YouTube page, the Lincoln Parish Museum, and Lawrence Gibbs and I, we just recorded 2 more episodes of Sounds Like Edison. And in that room there, we have a 1912 Edison phonograph A250 in mint condition, and there are 143 records from 1912 to 1926. So what we do is Lawrence does some research, we play the record, and we put that on YouTube. So that's helping promote who we are and what we do. So the YouTube page and also the Facebook page. And if you would be so kind, sign the book and put your email down, because I'm trying to convert the lists that we have, and so we can be a little bit more expedient and efficient with email. We're progressing, but we still have quite a long way to go. But I'm open to ideas, help, thoughts, anything for this, the second renaissance of the museum, to make this a place of greater relevance as we grow forward. I just wanted to read this one couple of sentences from the Chautauqua movement, and I found it relevant to exactly what we're doing here. And it was talking about I didn't realize how many Chautauquas were around the United States in the 1880s and 1890s, from Colorado to Nova Scotia to Georgia to Ruston, Louisiana. So it's one sentence. This reflected the intense desire, what is a Chautauqua? For self-improvement through education. Chautauqua had a strong influence on the rural communities and became shorthand for an organized gathering intended to introduce people to the great ideas, new ideas, and issues of public concern. So that's what's our charge, is to introduce people to great ideas, new ideas, and issues of public concern. And the hashtag I have is hashtag #EverLocalBee and hashtag Let's Create a Remarkable Future, and we can do that. So I think that's my house notes. I want to thank Wesley Harris for jumping up and introducing us, or reacquainting some of us, with Alan Green. The proverbial, we can sit and drink coffee or some bourbon or whatever you want to drink, and the what ifs, what if there was no Alan Green? What would this be here now? But Wesley, I think it's your turn.
Thank you, and appreciate y'all coming tonight. I think I probably know 75–80% of the people in the room, so very glad to see you. Let me just add something about the historical markers. We have a committee for the sesquicentennial, our 150th anniversary. Rick and I are both on that committee. And one of the things that I wanted to do when we first started talking about this anniversary was trying to leave a legacy of some kind. Not just have a parade or something that's just going to blend in with all the other parades and those kinds of things, but something that will be left behind for others. So the historical markers is one of the things that we wanted to do that will be a lasting memory of this anniversary. Most of the markers in this parish were put up between 1974 and 1976, and Dr. Philip Cook, who just came in, was part of that committee that established those markers, identified the locations, and got those markers put up. And over the years, because that was a long time ago, some of those have disappeared, some of them have been broken, knocked over, and so forth. But the money to pay for those markers came through a grant to the Bicentennial Committee through the police jury. So the police jury has been very helpful in trying to restore the markers that are left. Some of the markers that had faded gray, they were black, aluminum with black paint. all the black paint is gone off of some of them, so they have been taking them down, repainting them, and putting them back up, and they look brand new. But there's some that we've been looking for years, and they've disappeared, so we want to replace those first. If we can raise more money, there's lots of historic locations in Lincoln Parish that are worthy of a marker if we can raise enough funds. But that's why we did the coin and the t-shirts, was try to raise some funds, because when our committee was established, we weren't giving any funding, so we've had to kind of do it on our own to fund some of these projects. But the coins and the t-shirts are back there, and I'll mention the U.S. Army coming through here on behalf of Alan Green in a moment. I'm not going to talk much about that because I've got a book that explains that in more detail back there if you want to check that out. But who was Alan Green? That's a difficult question to answer because he was a man of contradictions. And we'll try to talk a little bit about those contradictions. But he was, first of all, a businessman. He moved to Louisiana, and initially he lived in Arcadia and ran a business there. And I don't have a lot of information on that, but he ends up moving from Arcadia with his family to Vienna. And this would have been prior to the Civil War, so late 1850s. And the house that he lived in is still in Vienna. A lot of people don't know that, but his house is just north of the intersection there in Vienna. And the driveway to that house that runs off 167 was the original wire road that crossed North Louisiana. It's not down there where the asphalt is at the flashing light. It was actually 100 yards or so further north from there is where the wire road crossed. But he basically came through his front yard. And he ran a business in Vienna, and he started buying land. Now, where he got his money, I don't know. David Cargill, who has written about Green, may know a little bit more about that, but he amassed a large amount of land out what we call the White Lightning Road. And just before you get to Mitcham Orchard Road, if you're going up White Lightning, is where he lived, there facing the road. So he moved out there. He called that place Greensboro. But he is involved in all kinds of industries. He had a shoe factory and a tannery and, all kinds of commercial interest. So he was a fairly wealthy man for this area, because most people that lived around him were just poor farmers, raising just enough to feed their families, growing a little cotton. And for those farmers, the cotton was necessary because that's what they took to market to try to get some cash. So they grew crops to feed themselves and to feed their livestock, but they grew cotton to obtain some cash. So Green was not very controversial at this point. But when the Civil War came along, he was opposed to secession by the state of Louisiana. He was basically a unionist. So that probably gave him a hard time during the war, but he was, for the most part, left unmolested. But after the war, there was obviously a big change in the politics in Louisiana. The Democrats had been in charge for a very long time. Now the Republicans were in charge. Many of those were what we call today carpetbaggers. A lot of them were former military in the Union Army who had served in Louisiana, and they decided to stay in Louisiana and seek their political fortunes. Others were men who came from up north, like Marshall Twitchell, who became basically the Alan Green of Red River Parish. He controlled all the offices in that parish, like Alan Green would come to control every political office in Lincoln Parish. But for the Republicans to maintain that control when they were in the minority, they had to call on federal resources to protect them. So at this time, this part of Lincoln Parish, on up to somewhere between Vienna and Dubuque, was Jackson Parish. And when Lincoln Parish was created, took parts of a little bit of Union, a little bit of Claiborne, a little bit of Bienville, but a whole lot of Jackson Parish. So if you lived in Vienna, which was the largest population center in the north end of Jackson Parish, you lived a long ways from the courthouse, because the courthouse was in Vernon. You know what's in Vernon today? A flashing yellow light. That's pretty much it. There is a church there and an old cemetery, but it's hard to imagine now that there was a hotel and a courthouse and stores and so forth in Vernon. But you know, if you needed to go to the courthouse from Vienna, to go to the courthouse, take care of some business real quick, and ride back took an entire day. So there was a need for a parish seat or a new parish, and most people that lived in this part of the state wanted a new parish. But it didn't turn out exactly the way people wanted, because Alan Green, who was actually a police juror for the Jackson Parish Police Jury, he shows up at the poll at the courthouse. Everybody had to go to the courthouse to vote. You didn't have precincts where you would go to your local community clubhouse or church or school or whatever. Everybody had to go to the courthouse in Vernon to vote. Well, Alan Green waits until the day of the election and rides from his house, Greensboro, up on the White Lightning Road with his sons to Vernon, and declares himself the Republican candidate for state senate against a man that was well known in the area named Evander Graham, who was judge at the time, well-known attorney. He was a former officer in the Confederate Army, and everybody expected him to be winner by a landslide, because there was just another man in the race that apparently was not as well known in the population center. So Green shows up at the courthouse and says, "I am a candidate. I'm the Republican candidate for the state senate." Well, they have an election, and it takes a while for the votes to be counted, because you know you got a long string of people that's probably going around the courthouse a couple of times. So Alan Green gets tired of waiting. He goes back to Greensboro and comes back the next day. Well, he encounters a man and his son's last name of Allen, and they have a confrontation near the courthouse, and they exchange some gunfire, and Alan Green gets shot in the head. His son gets shot in the head, and they wound the two members of the Allen family. So they're arrested by the sheriff and taken before the judge, who is Evander Graham, the other candidate. So it gets kind of weird there, but the election is complete, and I just found these numbers today. But what happened was the Republicans were in complete control of the state capitol in New Orleans. It was in New Orleans at that time. And there was a returning board, election returning board, that was to certify each election in the state. Well, you had Democrats and what were called liberal Republicans, which all that meant was they were ready to get the troops out and try to get things back to normal, but you know, they basically believed in the Republican platform. So they were partnered with the Democrats, and then you had what was called the radical Republicans who wanted to punish the South. They wanted to take complete control from anybody else but themselves. And as I said, a lot of those were carpetbaggers. Well, so you had a real difference of opinion on this returning board, so it actually split in two. One of the returning boards was called the Lynch Board after John Lynch. He was a politician that headed that one returning board that was more pro-Democrat. And then you had the Isabel returning board, which was pro-Republican. So both boards were supposedly counting votes. Like I said, I just found these figures this morning. I've been looking for them for a couple of years. But the Isabel board said that Judge Graham got 1,500 votes and Alan Green got 719 votes. So he's defeated, right? But the Lynch board, the Republican board, said Alan Green got 1,039 votes and Judge Graham got 774. Now, I can't believe that kind of politics in Louisiana, can you? But, so there's a difference in who the winner of that election is. And the same thing with sheriff, and the same thing with the state senate down the road, and the state representative, and it was like that in every single parish. You know, this group said he won, and this group said he won. So what happens? You have two sheriffs at the courthouse, and you have two DAs, and you have two judges, because nobody wants to back down. But who's in control at the state capitol? The Republicans. And what do they have backing them up? They have what they called the Metropolitan Police in New Orleans, and they would send them out throughout the state to enforce what they thought was the right ruling. So eventually the Democrats have to back down because they don't have the firepower to defend those offices. So Alan Green takes office as the state senator, and his son takes office as state representative. So since they've got the Republican governor in New Orleans in their pocket, they can say, okay, these are the people we want on the police jury. This is who we want to be coroner, sheriff, because the law that was created by them, they wrote the bill, and Green shepherded it through the Senate and his son through the House to create Lincoln Parish from bits of the surrounding parishes. And that law says that the governor could appoint the first slate of officers. So how did he do that? Alan Green sent him a list for sheriff, coroner, judge, DA, police jury, school board, tax collector, coroner, everything. So those were all folks who were loyal to Alan Green. There was one person, his name was Spencer Petrie Coven, who had held many offices. He would end up being mayor of Ruston at a later time. But they made him clerk of court to try to appease the populace. And of course, that didn't go very far with every other office in the parish occupied by a Green loyalist. But he had complete control. He was king of the parish. He didn't have to answer to anybody. You know, and of course people were very upset, and they got even more upset when he moves the parish seat from Vienna to Greensboro. His living room was basically the courthouse. So people got angrier and angrier as things went along. But it really never got to the boiling point that it did in some other parishes. You know, in Grant Parish, they had the Colfax Massacre, where the returning board said that a number of African American candidates won office, so they took over the courthouse. So the Democrats rounded up all these former Confederate soldiers from the region down there, and they attacked the courthouse and killed about 200 men. And the Democrats lost 3, and there's a monument down there, not to the 200, but to the 3. So those kinds of things happen various places around the state. And all these Republican office holders are pleading with the governor and with the president. Ulysses Grant was president at the time, to send some troops, some federal troops, to protect them. So they did. They sent infantry troops, but they also sent the 7th Cavalry, which has always been associated with George Custer. But George Custer was a Democrat. So they left him behind because you didn't want him buddying up to the opposition. So you had 7th Cavalry units in the Shreveport area, and you had infantry units in Monroe, and they were supposed to try to maintain order, or in other words, keep the opposing party under control. But there's a law that says the Army cannot enforce law on United States soil. So they had to bring in United States Marshals, and the cavalry would just ride with the marshals, who had the official paperwork if they wanted to arrest somebody, to kind of be a show of force. And it got to the point here in Lincoln Parish with Green that he was beginning to fear for his life, especially after 100 horsemen rode up in his front yard demanding that all of those office holders resign, that they move all the records back to Vienna. And how did he respond? He said, "Why don't y'all get down off your horses and come on inside, and we'll have a drink and we'll talk about this." Well, that kind of confused him a little bit, because he didn't react the way they thought he would react. He didn't stand up to them, and he didn't back down. He invited them in for a drink. So some of the cooler heads in that group prevailed and basically told him, you're going to have to fix this, and they left. But shortly thereafter, the 7th Cavalry rides over from Shreveport, and they go to Claiborne Parish first, and they arrest the mayor of Homer and the judge and a couple other men. And believe it or not, they have a United States congressman with them. And when they come to Lincoln Parish, he gets away from the rest of the group, and the congressman spends the night at Alan Green's house on White Lightning Road, while the troops and the prisoners ride on to Vienna. They wanted to put them in the Vienna jail, and I can't remember the exact number, but they had somewhere between 75 and 100 arrest warrants for men in Lincoln Parish who were opposed to Alan Green. So they started going to the houses around Vienna, in particular, trying to locate these men. And of course, they weren't there. They were out in Darbone Swamp or somewhere. They weren't home to be arrested. They did end up arresting, I think, 3 men. One of them's name was James Huey, He was the former sheriff of Jackson Parish, but since he lived in Vienna, he's now in Lincoln Parish, so he's no longer sheriff. And they arrested a Lincoln Parish deputy sheriff and another man, and they take off for Monroe to the federal court because the U.S. Marshal can't enforce state law, he can only enforce federal law. So they're arresting them under what later was called, it wasn't called at that time, but they called it the Ku Klux Klan Act, or the Enforcement Acts. It was a series of federal laws about intimidating black voters, interfering with the justice system, and so forth. And that's what the charges were on these individuals. Well, they're headed to Monroe, and then they realize those guys in Vienna are going to telegraph Monroe, and there's going to be a mob waiting for us to take back these prisoners. So the lieutenant ahead of this cavalry unit and the U.S. Marshal decide we're going to send a trooper up the pole and cut the telegraph lines so they won't know we're coming. So they ride on to Monroe. They put their prisoners in the jail over there. And this becomes a national incident. And why is that? Why was it so significant that they cut this telegraph line? Any ideas? Sir? Well, it actually belonged to Western Union. Y'all have heard of Western Union. They ran the telegraph. But when you cut that telegraph line coming across North Louisiana, now the president can't communicate with anybody in Texas or any further west. So Western Union was extremely upset. You know, you got millionaires running this company in New York City, so they start sending messages to the president. You got to do something. You know, we can't have people cutting telegraph lines. It'd be like if someone goes out here and takes an axe and starts chopping into the phone cable underground. You know, that'd be disaster. You know, so the local judge, whose name was Trimble, he was actually a Republican, lived in Farmerville. He ran a newspaper in Farmerville. He issues an arrest warrant for the cavalry lieutenant and the U.S. Marshal. So now you have a posse from Lincoln Parish, headed by a deputy, headed to Monroe to get them. And I'll cut to the chase because it gets to be a rather long story. They go over there and they arrest the lieutenant and the marshal and bring them back to Vienna and put them in the jail. And eventually they let them go, but it comes real close to having a battle in downtown Vienna over this incident. But Allen Green eventually is going to lose control of his power because the next presidential election, 1876, the election where he became state senate was 1872. So 4 years later, 1876, there's a presidential election, and it's so close as far as the electoral college that it's a disputed election. So they need one more state to go one way or the other. You know, so they're kind of at an impasse. And basically what happens is the Democrats say, and I think it was Alabama, but I'm not sure of this, they said, we'll give you Alabama, and that'll give you the votes to get in the Republican president, but you got to pull all these troops out of the South. Well, when the troops left, Green's backing is gone. So, you know, it's not like they raided his house and attacked him or anything, but he eventually lost control, and that means that returning board and that Republican governor and all that in New Orleans lost their control. So you started seeing Democrats elected back into office again, and things to a large extent went back to the way they were before the Civil War. Right after the Civil War, they had passed a new state constitution in 1868, which gave freed African American men the right to vote and changed a lot of things about how the system worked. Well, what happened in 1876? They changed the Constitution again, basically back to the same system you had prior to the Civil War. So there were former slaves who were now supposedly free, but not really in a lot of ways. But eventually Allen Green loses that power. He continues to run those industries. He builds a road from Greensboro to the railroad, because the railroad is coming through Ruston now, or is going to. He's building this road to get his goods to the train station. Well, he builds it to the tracks, but there is no station there. He didn't come to Ruston because Ruston didn't quite exist yet. But he built it to where the closest point where the tracks would come nearest his property. So they build a little station there, and it's called Allen Green. And if you look at a map that shows the railroad across North Louisiana in the late 1800s, it'll have a dot there that says Allen Green. Well, what's there now is the city of Grambling. But it was called Allen Green for a long time. And then a man named Grambling builds a sawmill at that station, and eventually when the memory of Allen Green fades out, they begin to call it Grambling. I'm going to let David come up for just a moment and talk about his impressions. He was doing his research long before I had ever heard of Allen Green. So he's going to talk a little bit about his impressions of the man and what he found in his research.
Are you wiring me?
Yeah. Everything you say.
As soon as we get his microphone on.
Okay. I feel more confident now. Thanks, Wes. A little side note that I always found interesting, Dr. Cook may remember it. Dr. Cook was my thesis chairman at Tech before I went on to LSU. Dr. Cook, back in the vacuum. Little side note about the lieutenant that he's talking about, that either shot or cut the telegraph lines, was named Ben Hodgson, Hodgson, I believe.
Right.
He was from Pennsylvania, and he was a member of Custer's Cavalry. Custer's Cavalry, of course, was out of Alexandria in that area. Well, Hodgson did that. He got arrested, like Wes was talking about. Ends up going to New Orleans to be court-martialed, which I thought was very interesting. He got down there and appeared before the court-martial board, and he said, well, and Bob Levy might be interested in this, they did a plea bargain. He plea bargained himself. And Hodgkin said, well, I tell you, I just want to go back with Custer. He's moved on to the Dakota Badlands. He's left Alexandria. I just want to go and join him. I've always worked with him and been under him. So if you'll send me there, and so they plea bargained him out, and he said, I'll never be a problem again. I'll never disturb you again. He went to South Dakota and got killed on the Yellowstone with Major Reno at the Battle of the Bighorn. So that's how he ended up. So he never bothered anybody again. But that's what happens, I guess, when you get court-martialed. Wes asked me to give a few impressions, is the way we described it in conversations, and some adjectives, I guess I would say, about characteristics of Allen Green. So it's a little bit different twist than where he's gone from, but I'm going to use some here from some notes I've made. about my impressions of Alan Green. He was an entrepreneur of those days. How he got to have his fortune, I don't know either. But we know he went to Arcadia around 1850s, ended up in Vienna in the early 1860s. He's like 40 or 42 when he gets to Arcadia. He's from Georgia. Where he got his money, I don't know. But he must have been very successful. He must have been an entrepreneur at that time as well, because he went on from Vienna up to Greensboro off of White Lightning and had the sawmill and had a shoe factory and a tannery and then agriculture. So he was an entrepreneur. We know that about him in business, industry, and so forth. He employed, after the Civil War, he did a lot to help the community. He provided employment for what they called a lot of the Freedmen Bureau representatives, if you know your history. A lot of those people, as it seems to have turned out, were from the North, but he employed a lot of people. He was concerned about his community. I would say he was politically ambitious and very astute, but he was also an opportunist. He knew how to take advantage of a situation, and he did. As a unionist, he was viewed, I think Wes hasn't used the term, but I will, he was viewed as a scallywag. And you know what scallywags and carpetbaggers are, if you know your history, when they used to teach history in public schools and colleges and so forth. He was viewed as scallywag by his peers in the community. A lot of his success, wherever he got his fortune from, was doing some of the things that he wasn't opposed to, but he necessarily didn't support in the community. He had slaves. He had his own slaves. In his time in the around the Civil War time into the 1870s during Reconstruction, his property up at Greensboro was valued at around $70,000 or $75,000, and that was back in that day. That would be a lot of money today for most of us. But he had that kind of property and success. So he was astute, he was an entrepreneur, but he was also termed by some people as being self-serving, very self-serving for himself and his family. What Wes was talking about was a lot of these people he appointed and recommended to Warmoth or to Kellogg, who were the governors at those times, were his own family, his sons. William, Jackson, Charles. I think there were the three of them. They all ended up with these really nice jobs in the parish, in the state, and so forth. So he was a little self-serving as well for himself. He was trying to create, some people thought, a political dynasty. It's not just in the community, Vienna or later Ruston, but Vienna or Vernon. That's important, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is what time is that perspective in? And in his time, he was pretty controversial. He was a mass of contradictions and conflict. There was a lot of conflict already underway from the Reconstruction period. But he's a puzzling fellow when you study him a little bit. But what he did was in that time, it's hard for us to understand 160 years ago, 150 years ago when Ruston and Lincoln Parish was founded. We have to put ourselves back in that time, and that's sort of difficult for some of us to do. But selfless, probably so, because he did provide jobs and employment for freedmen. He did donate land. He did donate land for schools, not just, there was no Grambling at that time. He helped establish schools in the area and in the community. So he was thoughtful of this area. But, and then that'll be the end of it here. As a unionist or scallywag, he demonstrated, and I'm going to read something to you in a minute, that he demonstrated tolerance and a real concern for his community. He had a lot of opposition. He wasn't liked very much at all. But he built a pretty successful series of companies of industries and so forth. He did that some way, and he was successful. But I think he saw himself as a liberator, as a protector, as a guardian at that time. And he served that role. But that's not the way the times were at that time. So, reading from his tombstone, and Wes, I think we might mention this later on, his tombstone up at Pine Grove, and you can go see it because the police jury and other people have restored those tombstones. They were pretty well destroyed for Alan Green and his wife. His tombstone says his ideas were in advance of the community he lived. Well, I would add to that, it was in advance of the times that he lived. His community was one thing. The times he lived in didn't really accept what he was trying to do. And I guess one thing that Dr. Cook may remember, there's a book that I suggest if you want to know more about Evander M. Graham, published by Louisiana Tech by Dr. William Y. Thompson, if you remember him in the history department. And then I'll wrap it up with that. Dr. Thompson wrote the heroic figures, Green or Graham, Graham being Evander M. Graham. He said, and he wrote in his book, Allen Green, as some might see him, well, the man was ahead of his time. The tolerant, far-sighted village statesman who sought to heal the wounds of war and welcome the new freedmen into public life. And yet, he was a man whose political self-aggrandizement would call into question the selflessness of his actions. E.M. Graham, his opposition, well, he was a man more in keeping with his time. His section, his people, and who led the struggle against the excesses and sometimes bad government of the Reconstruction. Yet he was a man willing to resort to force and violence to thwart the political and social life and change. So they were two very different people. And you can say all the things you want to about Green, but he did do a lot of good things for the community in the area. He was ahead of his community, but he was also ahead of his time.
Thank you, David.
You bet.
Hey, you said, you know his home in Vienna was northwest Vienna. Do y'all know where his home was in Arcadia?
I don't. I never have known. I'm not even
No.
sure of the Greensboro location, other than, you know, where Gone Grove Cemetery is. And beyond that, I think Mr. Kraft owned a lot of that property, had pecan orchards and so forth. I think all back up in there was the old Greensboro. But I don't know where it was in Arcadia. And I've only recently learned that the old, what we know as the Hornsby House in Vienna, the old stagecoach house, but that originally was Green's house as well.
Right. The house in Vienna is owned by the Goff family. It's a two-story, originally a dog trot house, which means it was there was a breezeway down the middle. That has been enclosed. We're hoping to do a history driving tour later this year, where we'll have people stationed at various locations around the parish to talk a little bit about the history of that location. And the Goffs have agreed to have a site there. One of the Greens' young children is buried on that property. And I was fascinated when I found out that the house was still there, because I've been researching Allen Green for 15, 20 years and had no idea there was still a house. My dad grew up on White Lightning Road within sight of where his house would have been, and never heard the story until I started doing some research later on. But I think the house was, if you're going up White Lightning Road and you're going to that big power line, and there's a road to the right that goes towards Hilly, and the cemetery is right there as you make that right turn. I think if you look to the left, instead of making that right turn, I think that's where the house was. We have an old map upstairs where some old timers got together and they marked where some Civil War camps were, and they marked Allen Green's house right there on White Lightning Road. So I'm going to go with that. Yeah, so you would say you lived in Vienna if you lived up in that neighborhood.
Is this house it's on 167 North? It's on
The existing house is on 167 North. It's
Right or left?
on the right. It's the first house after you go through the intersection.
And it's hidden off the road.
Yeah, so you can barely see it from the highway.
And that's going westbound?
That is going north. Yeah, on 167. The house is still there. The house he later lived in has been gone for decades.
We used to call it in my youth the Hornsby House. If you're familiar with that area, maybe Bob knows it as that as well. But Bob has that corner lot right there where it's vacant, it's empty, It's the very next drive beyond that, basically, isn't that right? From what I was told some time ago, the vats and so forth that Green used for his tannery and his factory and so forth, if anybody knows what's known as McClure Hill around here, anybody been around long enough to know McClure Hill? Well, as you're headed toward Homer, there's that long hill that goes way down to the bottom. That's known as McClure Hill back in the day. And supposedly up in that area somewhere, there are still some vats, if you know where to look for them, concrete vats. I've never seen them.
Like I said, my dad grew up out there, so I've run over that whole thing. And that was back in the early 70s, and they were long gone by then. But that information comes from a book written by Kathleen Graham, who was Judge Graham's daughter. So she tells the story about that election, and she didn't like Allen Green too much. She did admit that he was a nice neighbor and helped people out, but to her dying days, she hated that man because of what happened to her father. That book, it's called The Notes on the History of Lincoln Parish or something to that effect. If you've ever seen the great big blue Lincoln Parish history book, about 600 pages, that's the very first thing in that book, is her book, is repeated in there. One of the things we tried to do with this anniversary committee was how we're going to make that book available again, because it was printed in 1976, same time these markers were put up. And the only way you can go to the library and see a copy. You can't check it out. But if you wanted a copy, you'd have to look on eBay and hope one gets listed. And when it does, they're usually between $200 and $400. So we got the Louisiana Tech Archives to digitize that Lincoln Parish history book. And it is on the Parish Library's website. If you go to their history page, you can see that entire book with an index. It did not have an index originally, so this is the book. You can't search it because each page is actually a photograph of the pages in the book, but you can look in the index and find family names or locations or whatever, and you can look it up by the page number. But I felt like that was a real accomplishment that so many people that weren't even born when this book was written. This is the index. We've added that to it. So, I mean, this is 200 pages right here. So it's very detailed. But if you want to read Kathleen Graham's account of the election, it's on that library history page.
This one also is good.
Yeah. That's a little harder to find because there wasn't nearly as many of those printed. But you can find that on eBay or Amazon sometimes.
This is about E.M. Graham. It gives the details of a lot about this.
I have also written a little book that focuses basically on that roundup of the citizens by the cavalry, and it's actually called the Roundup. We've got copies of that in the back that when you go back there to buy your commemorative coin and your T-shirt, you check out that book also. But it's he's a fascinating man, Allen Green, and there's obviously good things about him. There's bad things about him. He almost caused a war, and we would have the same reputation some of these other parishes have, where hundreds and hundreds of people were killed during Reconstruction. There was obviously some conflicts, but not nearly to what some other parishes experienced. And I think we can attribute that to the type of people who moved to this parish when it was created. You know, there were towns across North Louisiana that virtually dried up and disappeared, like Sparta, Mount Lebanon, and places like that, where people knew the railroad was coming, so they moved to the new parish. And these were the best and the brightest of those communities. And there were some really smart people and some people that knew violence was not going to solve anything. So I think that played a large role in, even though we had a very difficult situation, that we didn't have that kind of bloodshed. Because Marshall Twitchell that I mentioned in Red River Parish, Red River was also a parish that was created about this time. And the reason they're creating these parishes is because these people that want power, they need an office. They need to be a senator or control the parish in some way. Well, somebody's already in control of the parishes around Lincoln, so create another parish, and now somebody else can be in charge there. So it's also, you know, you may have heard in the news lately about packing the Supreme Court to get a certain philosophy on the Supreme Court. When you create these new parishes and you've got the same party in charge, you're basically packing the legislature. So, but in Red River Parish, Marshall Twitchell was shot and left for dead. All his brothers and brother-in-laws that he brought from Vermont with him were killed. You know, it was a massacre. The Grant Parish, the Colfax massacre, I've already told you, several hundred died there. When the newspapers would talk about Caddo Parish, they always called it Bloody Caddo, because there were hundreds of people being killed every year. Not in one mass incident like these other parishes, but throughout the years of Reconstruction. So it was a very violent time, and you know, there was no Civil War battles in this part of Louisiana. Supposedly they could hear the cannons at Vicksburg in Vienna every once in a while. I find that very hard to believe, but there were no Union soldiers that got any further than Calhoun sugaring area. So this part of the country, from here to Minden to the Arkansas state line, did not face the type of violence that other parts of the state did until Reconstruction. That's when the war started here. So we're very fortunate that the type of people that lived in Lincoln Parish had some restraint. They valued education, and they created a place that's very worthy of living. The parishes around us are in dire straits. I work at the Claiborne Parish Library as a historian, and in the 40s, and there were 35,000 people living in Claiborne Parish. There are 14,000 people living in Claiborne Parish today, and 2,000 of those are in the state prison. So, you know, it's seeing hard times, and we're very fortunate here in Lincoln Parish. Any questions? Okay.
We know that Lincoln Parish, you said, was formed in 1873.
Right.
All right. How did he pick the 4 parishes that he was gonna take a corner from, and how did he do it with no violence? This is Alan Green.
Well, there was interest in having a new parish. Like I said, it was a long ride to Vernon. So there wasn't a lot of pushback there, but I mean, all this is taking place in New Orleans. He and his son write this bill, and it's a relatively short bill, but it names the boundaries, and it names creeks and latitude lines and those kinds of things to establish the boundary. Of course, he wanted Greensboro to be in it, so it took the largest chunk of Jackson Parish. And it's really just a very small part of Union, Claiborne, and Bienville. But you know, the law's passed before anybody back here is going to be aware of what's going on.
But how did he pick the name Lincoln?
Abraham Lincoln. That was really jabbing it in there to the locals that it was being named after Abraham Lincoln.
Wesley, are you aware of any local descendants that live here of Valley
If you're related to Alan Green, raise your hand.
He's our three
Is
times.
that relate, are those Greens, and his name was spelled Greene?
yeah.
Right, E on the end.
Related to the Greens, like Mary Olive Davis?
No. No connection.
He had a grandson that ran against our friend Jerry Huckabee for Congress in the 80s. He lived down, he moved here from New York, lived in a home down there with First Baptist Church that owns now, and ran against Jerry. He didn't get many votes, and he died
Right.
after that.
I was telling them earlier that we used to have contact information for grandsons or great-grandsons with the last name Green here at the museum, but I guess they eventually all passed away, but they're related to Maddie Green, the daughter, who married a Wright. So if the last name's Wright in Lincoln Parish, they're more than likely a descendant of Alan Green.
How about the Grahams? Any
I'm not sure about that. You know, I know it. I don't remember the family tree. I know the daughter that wrote the book never married, so there were no children on that.
Sister, Dr. Francis, but the two lived here
Right.
at the end of Vienna Street.
So as far as I know, there are no descendants of Judge Graham. Any other questions? If you look at the coins back there, David mentioned the importance of education. I think Rick may have mentioned it also. On the front of the coin, the colors are black and gold for Grambling State University, and the colors on the back are red and blue for Louisiana Tech. That's how important we think education is